They said Oldtown had never fallen to an Ironborn invasion. Not truly. Not during the days of the Whore Kings, nor the Reavers before them. Some claimed the city's walls and the tall high tower were impervious to the might of any sea lord. Others said it was the strength of House Hightower and their alliances that kept Oldtown safe. Still others, especially the Maesters, insisted it was knowledge itself, a power subtle and vast, that protected the Citadel's home. Over the centuries, the city had survived countless threats, yet Euron Greyjoy was no ordinary threat. He did not come to Oldtown with only ballads of plunder in his heart. Rumor said he was guided by darker winds and listened to voices no living man ought to heed. Of course, the whispers went further. They said he had old gifts, gleaned from travels in distant lands, from black sorceries half remembered in the pages of forbidden tomes. Some sailors had glimpsed the silence at sea, its sails red as dried blood. Others insisted the ship's hull was stained with monstrous symbols, wards that warded nothing and invoked devils from across the narrow sea. Perhaps these tales were the usual exaggerations. Maybe the truth was simpler, a cunning pirate lord with insatiable ambition. But for Oldtown, for the Maesters in their great citadel, and for the common folk who prayed that the walls would not burn, the cause mattered less than the terror. Euron Greyjoy was coming. The Iron Fleet slipped past the Arbor's watch first. They broke the Redwine blockade when no watchers were at the highest parapets, or else some watchers simply disappeared without a cry, their bodies fed to the hungry waves. The stories scattered along the Mander's coast in the days that followed were uncertain. But the result was not. When the sun rose on a summer morning that should have been glorious and bright, the Iron Fleet's sails appeared, black and towering in the dawn's light, gliding through the whispering sound. Ravens were sent to the Reach, to Highgarden, to King's Landing if any Tarly or Tyrell bannermen possessed the means. Yet ravens could not conjure an army overnight, nor could they reach men's hearts with the dread that Oldtown's watchers felt, gazing westward at those ghostly sails. Inside the citadel, the day began as always with bells signaling different hours. Novices scurried about, some carrying bread from the city's ovens to the Fortress of Learning, some bustling in with early deliveries of parchment, quills, new samples of exotic substances from Lys or Volantis to be studied by the Archmasters. The library, vast, labyrinthine, was filled with men in robes the color of dust, books chained to lecterns, scrolls from an earlier age stored in nooks and corners. Candles flickered, and the early morning's hush of scholars exchanging quiet words hung over it all. The ravens in their roosts cawed, restless. Perhaps they sensed something in the wind, a strange and violent odor that belonged more to the sea than to any library. Archmaester Polivar was among those who recognized the moment for what it was, though he could not have guessed the scale. He had studied naval histories, had written essays on the rebellions of the Iron Islands, and was not ignorant of Euron Greyjoy's name. He felt an unease clawing at him as soon as one of the younger maesters, chain tinkling around his neck, rushed in with breathless news that the Iron Fleet was sighted. Polivar could hardly believe it. Cautious counsel was best. Surely the city's defenders would rally, man the walls, call forth the banners from the surrounding lands. But as the Iron Fleet drew nearer, he felt an indescribable sense of doom, as if Oldtown's centuries of might and learning might not be enough against the terror of a single man. Through the morning, the citadel's higher ranks assembled. Grave men, some stooped with age, rubbed their chins or tapped their fingers on polished wooden tables. They debated. Should the knowledge within be evacuated or hidden? Could the library's most valuable texts be secreted away? Some argued that strong stone walls and the city's defenders were more than sufficient. Others reminded them how seldom the citadel, with all its knowledge, had truly faced an all-out assault by a force that wanted destruction, not conquest. The high towers would never permit the destruction of the citadel, said a few. The city guard was strong, but lurking behind all these words was the name, Euron. The man was like a demon in the rumor mill, a cunning shape that smelled of salt and iron and dark promise. Far below, Oldtown's harbor bustled with life. Fishermen scrambled to salvage nets and haul them onto the wharves, fish guts and salt stinging the air. Merchants who had hoped to begin a prosperous day of trade found themselves startled to see sails on the horizon, black flags fluttering ominously. Although Oldtown had faced pirates before, never had the Watchers glimpsed so many Ironborn ships gliding in under the same banner. The wide southwestern approach to the city offered a vantage for any who dared climb the towers and look out. And as the minutes bled on, more ships seemed to slide out of the haze of dawn as if conjured from a nightmare. The harbor's daily noise dimmed, replaced by a hush, the kind that comes just before a storm breaks. In the fortress of House Hightower, Lord Leighton's men readied themselves. The portcullis was lowered, the gates sealed, the city's old walls, high and thick, were lined with watchmen. Archers strung their bows, crossbowmen tested their strings, militia sharpened spears. Word was that one or two smaller vessels might have tried to flee, but the Ironborn gave chase with lethal speed, and soon Oldtown's harbor was bottled in by a blockade the city had never seen. The sun's path across the sky felt painfully slow, but with each passing hour, tension mounted in the streets, in the citadel's cloisters, and in the hearts of every soul who realized that war had arrived at their doorstep. Euron Greyjoy came ashore just after midday, not at the city's main harbor but at a lesser quay further down the Whispering Sound. The Silence was anchored in full view, her hull a labyrinth of arcane carvings, her mast crowned with the shrieking figure of some nightmarish creature. Men disembarked with him, men with sullen eyes and reaver axes, their salt-soaked hair braided or shaved in strange patterns. They gave way as their captain stepped forward. He was clad in black leather and dark mail, a patch over one eye, the other shimmering with a cold, unnatural glimmer. A red cloak, stolen from some foreign lord or dyed in a color reminiscent of old blood, draped across his shoulders. He carried himself like a king, though no throne recognized him as such. He needed no herald, his presence alone was enough. At once, Oldtown's defenders challenged the approach. A company of city guard, stiff in rank, bellowed out warnings, but Euron laughed. He had brought with him a brutal contraption of war, a massive iron ram hammered together on the deck of the Iron Fleet's largest ship, and it smashed the wharves like thunder. Archers loosed arrows at him, and some found their marks among Euron's men. Yet for each Ironborn that fell, two more stepped forward. The low ring of battered shield against battered shield sounded out, the hiss of axes meeting swords. Oldtown's defenders were not unskilled, but the Ironborn of the Silence and her sister ships possessed a ferocity beyond measure, a desire to sow chaos that flickered in their eyes. In the face of savage thrusts and vicious laughter, the city guard reeled back. Even so, had it been a conventional battle, Oldtown's walls and the might of House Hightower might have eventually forced the Ironborn to withdraw. The city dwarfed the raiders in size, and the Hightower's militia, augmented by volunteers from lesser houses in the region, formed a considerable defense. Yet Euron Greyjoy had come prepared for more than a typical raid. He had, through cunning or sorcery, or by forging alliances with those who craved destruction, secured an arsenal of fear. Some spoke of wildfire casks, stolen or purchased from disreputable merchants who once did business in King's Landing. Others suspected he had roused foul sorcerers from shadowy corners of Essos. Whatever the truth, the fact remained, there was an unnatural heat behind his men's assault, as if a greater malice than mere Ironborn reaving fueled them. From the ramparts, knights loyal to House Hightower tried to rally. Horns were blown. Bells rang out across the city's squares. War drum beats sounded along the docks as the tide of Ironborn spilled onto the quays, savage and relentless. Smoke began to curl into the sky, first from the ships that had been set aflame to block retreat, then from storage sheds near the harbor. Townsfolk who had never held a sword found themselves drawn into the conflict or fled indoors, barricading shutters. Shouts echoed in the alleyways, the flicker of torches casting wavering shadows on the cobblestones. Screams rose as Ironborn hacked down soldiers and civilians alike. The stench of blood, salt, and smoke joined in an awful brew that seeped through the harbor district. Euron himself took the brunt of the city's terror upon his shoulders. He roared to his men, urging them to press forward, to take what they would and burn the rest. When a squad of militia faced him, they faltered at the sight of that single pale blue eye. One spearman jabbed, only for Euron to sidestep with surprising speed and jam a dagger beneath the soldier's helm into the soft flesh of the throat. The man went down gurgling. A second soldier swung a short sword. Euron let the blade scrape the mail of his arm before twisting his axe in a savage upward arc, cleaving the attacker's jaw. Crimson splashed on the stones, and the Pirate King laughed, a mirthless sound that seemed to resonate with the gloom of the day. A panic began to spread through the defenders. Some fled deeper into the city, hoping to regroup. Others retreated to the high walls near the starry September or to the citadel's gates, hoping that if Euron turned his eye on the Fortress of Learning, at least they could hold him back a while. But Euron and his men battered their way onward, unstoppable as a tide. The day turned into a chaos of smoke and echoing carnage. Dusk found Oldtown's southwestern districts in flames. Shanties and smaller homes burned quickly. The mightier stone structures resisted, but the rooftop timbers caught fire nonetheless. Refuse and rubble littered the streets. Families huddled in basements or cellars. The once proud city, a beacon of culture and scholarship, was discovering the cost of underestimating the cruelty of Ironborn with a fearsome captain at their head. Inside the citadel, Archmaester Polivar and the others convened again. From the windows of the eastern cloister, they could see the black clouds rolling upward, illuminated from below by flickers of orange flame. Thick smoke stung their eyes even at this distance. The sound of war carried across the city's sprawl, a low murmur, but no one doubted what it signaled. Some wanted to open the citadel's gates to let in refugees. Others insisted that the fortress must remain sealed, or Euron's men would soon flood the halls and ravage everything. Arguments rose, nearly breaking the quiet, thoughtful facade the maesters prided themselves upon. They had prepared for many contingencies over the centuries. They had knowledge of medicine, of herb lore, of architecture, warfare, even the rumored secrets of black magic. But no thick tome could turn a blade aside. No dusty scroll could smother a city's flames, not unless one possessed the means to conjure water from the clouds or to quell the thirst of fires with a wave of the hand. Still, the citadel was not defenseless. The high towers had stationed guards at the main entrance, city watchmen reinforced with a handful of knights and sellswords. The gates were strong, made of thick oak banded with iron, and the walls around the citadel soared high. Maesters and novices alike helped stack barrels of oil and sharpen improvised pikes. Rare was the day that these men of learning took up arms, but as novices lifted swords with trembling hands, as acolytes hovered near the arrow slits, it became obvious that this was such a day. Danger was not across the sea, nor beyond the horizon. It stood at Oldtown's threshold, hungry to strike. And if Euron Greyjoy had decided to burn the citadel, he would have it done or die trying. A man like him would not balk at slaughtering scholars if it meant forging his legend in blood and ash. Night came, the darkness broken only by the glow of fires. From high vantage points, the shape of Oldtown's many districts could be seen. An uneven expanse of streets and squares, some still untouched, others devoured by flame. The upper windows of the starry September cast no comforting radiance. The faith militant had armed themselves, determined not to let the city's holy place be desecrated, though no one felt certain they could stand against the Ironborn. Bells tolled in intervals, but soon even the faithful bells had grown silent. The watchers had more pressing tasks than ringing alarms that all the city already knew. That same night, Euron held a makeshift court upon the wharf he had taken, near the southwestern approach. The silence loomed behind him, her deck lit by iron braziers. The sails no longer needed to be raised. Instead, Euron's men hammered spikes into the wood of the quay, forging a small palisade from salvaged beams and pieces of shattered ships. At his back hung banners looted from lesser houses, their sigils already torn or burnt. He drank from a tall black horn set with red gold. When some of his men shouted for ale, he gestured graciously, as if a generous king. Barrels were rolled off one of the captured merchant vessels. While the reavers drank and boasted, while they drew lots to see who would carry out the next day's foraging and pillaging, Euron stared into the darkness as if listening to a voice none could hear but him. A hush spread among the men, a whispered tension about the future. Some had heard rumors that House Redwine's fleet could arrive soon, that the Tyrell armies might ride from Highgarden, or that the crown might send help. But Euron listened, unafraid. Each rumor only seemed to amuse him. His close captains, long-serving Ironborn with savage eyes, crowed that no force in Westeros could match the cunning of the Iron Fleet, not so long as Euron led it. Others, less certain, clutched at their weapons and stole glances up the dark waters of the Whispering Sound, half expecting a flaming war galley to come hurtling down on them. Yet Euron exuded confidence, a black aura of certainty. He spoke of a single target, the citadel itself, seat of all the knowledge that the tall-robed maesters hoarded. Burn it, he promised, and the entire realm would feel the blow. Let them rely on half-remembered lore as they faced the storms to come. Let them quake at the might of the Ironborn. There in the gloom, Euron rose and addressed his men. He declared that he would lead a host at dawn to the citadel's gates, tear them open, and feed the libraries to the flames. Those who fought well would claim the spoils of victory. We will shatter their illusions of safety, he said, voice low and carrying over the lapping waves. We will break their minds, for once knowledge burns, fear grows. Then he drank deeply from the black horn and let out a mad laugh. His men banged their weapons on shields in response, the sound echoing across the flickering water. Morning found Oldtown shrouded in a haze of ash. The southwestern portion of the city was still smoldering, but Euron wasted no time. He and his men advanced deeper into the winding streets, forcibly subduing any pockets of resistance. They faced arrow fire from rooftops, potshots with crossbows from behind shuttered windows. But they pressed forward, unstoppable as a wave. Word spread among the city guard that the Ironborn were marching on the citadel. A hurried muster of defenders rallied near the approach, led by a knight in shining armor, Ser Andrus Mullendor, sworn to House Hightower, a man who had never truly faced pitched war but who believed wholeheartedly in honor and duty. He was joined by a company of star-helmed guards, men from the starry September who volunteered to defend the city of their faith. They had no illusions about what faced them, but they intended to try. The confrontation spilled onto the wide thoroughfare that ran along Oldtown's central canal, leading toward the great footbridge that spanned the Honeywine River, the last major crossing before the Citadel's gatehouse. On either side rose tall buildings that once housed traders, ropemakers, dock workers, or ferry operators. Now, the windows were shuttered or the structures were blackened by smoke. Rubble from battered walls littered the street. The canal's surface was gray with ash, and every so often a body floated by, face blackened and hair singed. Ser Andrus stood at the head of his men, sword gleaming. He gave a brief speech, telling them that the eyes of the Seven were upon them, that they fought to protect the seat of learning and culture in the realm. Across from them, the Ironborn formed a loose line, scowling or sneering. Euron himself prowled on a black horse stolen from the city stables. The horse whinnied, skittish at the reek of death in the air. But Euron kept it in check with a gloved fist. The patch over his left eye seemed a black hole in the daylight, and his mouth curled in a disdainful smirk. He raised one gauntlet hand. In response, Ironborn archers loosed a volley of arrows. The defenders braced behind shields, but more arrows flew. Then both sides charged. The clash was fierce. Ser Andrus led the defenders' cavalry, but the chaos of the narrow street made it hard to maneuver. Archers on the Ironborn side picked out horses where they could, and several knights went down in bloody tangles of limbs. On foot, the starry September's men roared in defiance, meeting the swirling axes and cutlasses of Euron's reavers with battered shields. At the onset, the defenders seemed to hold fast, for the Ironborn assault came in uneven waves. But soon Euron himself rode through their ranks, an axe in one hand, a slender sword in the other, slashing at the defenders. His men took courage at the sight. The Ironborn pressed harder. Their brutality overcame the defenders' discipline. One by one, knights fell, battered from their saddles or pinned to the ground under a flurry of blows. The city's men tried to rally, but Euron's presence had become like a black star pulling them into oblivion. Ser Andrus spied Euron in the melee, recognized the pale blue eye, the red cloak flecked with soot. He spurred his horse forward, mouth set in grim determination. He did not speak but angled his sword for a fatal blow. Euron sensed the challenge. He parried with a laugh that chilled the blood. Hooves thundered on the stone as the horses collided, chest to chest. Ser Andrus slashed. Euron's sword came up to deflect, steel sparking. The Ironborn captain reeled sideways but recovered, burying his axe into Ser Andrus's breastplate. The blow did not fully penetrate but crushed the metal inward with brutal force. Ser Andrus gasped, trying for a second strike, but Euron kicked him from the saddle with ease. The knight tumbled, rolled across the stones, sword rattling from his grip. Before he could rise, an Ironborn reaver sank a spear through his neck. Euron urged his horse onward, a silent, unstoppable presence in the swirl of carnage. Defenders on the footbridge turned to flee. The surviving militiamen attempted a last defense, but Nick rippled among them. They had not expected such unstoppable savagery nor the horrific rumor that Euron bore with him casks of wildfire. At any moment, they feared the whole street might erupt in green flame. So they broke, sprinting for the citadel gates to warn the guards. The footbridge, slick with blood, became a sight of slaughter. Ironborn crossbowmen took aim at the fleeing men's backs, sending them toppling into the Honeywine or onto the dusty paving stones. A few defenders managed to escape, scrambling over battered wagons to find a narrow alley toward the citadel's fortress walls, but it was too few to form any meaningful stand. In the citadel courtyard, novices and younger maesters tried to calm the fluttering ravens, which cawed loudly at the smell of smoke. A few older maesters directed them to send final, urgent messages. The ravens soared skyward, heading for Highgarden or perhaps King's Landing, but none knew if they would reach their destinations before the city fell. What was certain was the thunder of battle approaching, echoing across the water. Once the footbridge was secured, Euron and his vanguard advanced. The citadel's main gatehouse was a sturdy fortification with a raised drawbridge. From the ramparts, the defenders hurled stones and loosed arrows. The Ironborn used mantlets and large wooden screens to push forward. On Euron's command, they placed small barrels, casks of a vile substance, against the thick gates. A greenish liquid dribbled around them, an unmistakable sheen. Inside, the maesters watched in mounting horror. One archmaester with a link of black iron around his chain recognized the color for what it was, wildfire. He shouted for the men to douse it for the love of all the gods. Boiling water was poured from above, but the Ironborn archers forced the men on the walls to duck. Then one of Euron's men lit a torch. A hush seemed to pass over the entire courtyard, like a collective inhalation that could never be fully exhaled. Fire met wildfire. The explosion rocked the gatehouse, sending shards of wood and stone flying in all directions. The entire fortress seemed to groan. A few defenders were hurled from the ramparts to their deaths. Smoke billowed, noxious and bright. Coughing, ice streaming, the defenders tried to rally. But the gates were blasted wide, the drawbridge partly collapsed, and amidst the broken ruin, the Ironborn poured in. What followed was worse than any mere sacking. The citadel's defenders, outnumbered and reeling, fought in pockets of desperate resistance. Archmaester Polivar fell quickly, stabbed through the belly by a reverse spear as he tried to order novices into retreat. Other maesters locked themselves in the library's inner chambers, hoping the thick stone walls would hold. Ironborn battered at the doors with axes and iron bars. With a crash, the sanctum gave way and screams rang out among the unarmed men inside. Euron strode through the chaos, stepping over fallen defenders, ignoring the pleas of maesters who clutched precious scrolls or tried to reason with him. For them, there was no reasoning. The time for words had passed. This was a crucible of war, the forging of a grim legend. Soon enough, Euron arrived at the heart of the library's domain. Shelves soared from floor to vaulting ceiling, stuffed with precious volumes. Rolling ladders stood by shelves, and glass lanterns flickered with trembling light. The smell of old parchment was thick, and had the place been still, it might have felt like the realm's greatest treasure trove. But it was not still. Euron commanded his men to scatter flammable liquids among the aisles, to rip parchment from shelves. Some reavers laughed as they tossed priceless tomes to the floor. Inkpots shattered. Scrolls were trod underfoot. The hush of centuries of scholarship gave way to savage howls and the scraping of steel. Euron Greyjoy, patch gleaming, turned in a slow circle as if savoring the moment. An elderly maester, robes torn, staggered forward, tears staining his face. He attempted to shield a particular volume with his body. "Please," he croaked, "this knowledge, these are the memories of our world." Euron kicked him aside without a word, then seized the volume. He glanced at the maester's tearful expression as if gauging the old man's desperation. Then, with a cruel grin, he tossed the book into a pile forming in the aisle. Another reaver ignited a torch. The maester tried to throw himself on the pile to extinguish the flame, but Euron dragged him back by the collar and flung him to the ground. Within moments, the library caught. At first, the fire flickered uncertainly, but then the dry parchment, the old wooden beams, the tapestry curtains of the reading alcoves all surrendered. Smoke churned in thick plumes, swirling around shelves and archways. Ironborn howled in triumphant glee, fueling the flames with more manuscripts, more scrolls. Some even tore free pages, letting them flutter in the superheated air, cackling as centuries of labor were reduced to drifting ash. The roar of the fire soared, devouring shelf after shelf. The heat became intolerable, yet Euron lingered, enthralled by the spectacle. Red and orange tongues of flame licked the walls, and somewhere deeper in the library, a roof beam collapsed with a thunderous crack, sending sparks and embers careening upward in an angry whirlwind. Across the courtyard, in the other wings of the citadel, novices fled or barricaded themselves in storerooms. A few with some knowledge of arms had formed a last stand near the ravenery, determined not to let the birds, nor the small portion of scrolls stored there, fall without a fight. They resisted valiantly when Euron's men arrived, but it was hopeless. An axe shattered the lock on the ravenery's doors, and one by one, the untrained defenders were cut down. The ravens, terrified by the commotion, flew into a frantic mass, beating their wings against the rafters. Some soared outside through any open window, vanishing into the smoky sky. Others caught in the corners, as if lamenting the downfall of the place they called home. The Ironborn spared no time to chase the birds. They laughed as they tore through caged coops and scattered feed, for their savage hearts cared little for war's trifles. Then came the final blow. Euron commanded wildfire casks to be placed in the citadel's central courtyard. The plan was to ensure the entire fortress was consumed, that no hidden vault or locked chamber could survive. Even as the library's flames climbed to dizzying heights, Euron wanted more. He had told his men in hushed moments that he yearned to watch the entire structure collapse, to set the realm on a course of ignorance so that the Ironborn might rule the seas unchallenged. Some believed he followed the whisper of a demon or the urging of some black magic. Others thought it was pride, the mad desire of a man who believed he could unmake centuries of tradition with a single conflagration. Regardless, the effect was the same. Those defenders still alive tried to contain the madness. Some even attempted to drag the casks away, but they were struck down with savage finality. A spark was all it took, and the courtyard erupted into a blooming flower of green flame. The sound was deafening, a roar that slammed the ears and stole the breath from one's lungs. The ground trembled. Doors, windows, buttresses, pillars, everything seemed to burst outward in a hail of debris. Fires that had started as small pockets now spread with unstoppable fury. Billowing smoke soared high into the sky, forming a black and green inferno that dwarfed every other blaze in the city. Euron stood just outside the courtyard, forced to shield his own face from the sudden explosion's heat. Even he could not stand too close to wildfire's fury. His men stumbled back, some with singed beards, others nursing burns. But where lesser men might shrink from the horror, Euron merely gazed upon it with a twisted wonder. The screams of maesters trapped behind flaming rubble, the hiss of collapsing roofs and shattered glass, all of it formed a cacophony that seemed to enthrall him. The throbbing glow of the flames danced in his eye, a reflection of a man who had come to unmake the greatest storehouse of lore in Westeros. And he was succeeding. The pillars of the citadel, those great towers that housed specific faculties, astronomy, ravenry, healing, alchemy, and more, were built of stone. They did not burn easily, but their wooden floors and shelving did. The interior beams cracked, caving in, and soon entire floors collapsed with horrifying thunder. Some of the towers swayed precariously. One gave way entirely, toppling sideways in a cascade of red sparks and smoke. Its roof slid down the side of another building before smashing into the courtyard below, setting off a chain reaction of embers. At the edges of the conflagration, scorched novices crawled, eyes streaming, skin blistered. Most did not escape. The Ironborn, enthralled by their captain's will, cut down or captured any straggler. Mercy was not a word that found a place on their tongues that day. Across the Honeywine, citizens watched the rising plume of smoke in mute horror. Some had not yet fallen victim to the Ironborn's rampage, but they stared, disbelieving, as the citadel pride of Oldtown was being destroyed. Even those who had scorned the maesters or disliked the city's haughty scholars felt a pang of dread at the sight. A piece of Westeros' soul was dying in those flames, an intangible center of knowledge that had guided kings and lords, taught healers and stonemasons, and shaped the realm's understanding of history and magic. Now it crumbled amid shrieks and roaring fire. Once in a while, a flock of ravens burst from some broken window, scattering into the sooty sky, a last vestige of the citadel's connection to the wider world. Eventually, Euron's men withdrew from the heart of the citadel, letting the wildfire finish the task. They regrouped in the courtyard just beyond the main gates, battered but triumphant. They had lost some men in the chaos, for wildfire was a fickle ally, but morale soared among the survivors. They had not only taken Oldtown's southwestern reaches, they had also done the unthinkable. They had destroyed the Citadel's precious library, a blow that no one had believed possible. Euron surveyed them with amusement, a cold smile flickering on his lips. He said nothing of pity or regret. He raised his black horn, and the men cheered, their voices echoing with the crackle of flames behind them. In the swirling clouds overhead, the greenish hue of wildfire tinted the sunlight, giving the entire scene a nauseating glow. Yet Euron was not content to linger. He gestured to a few men to remain, to keep the city subjugated, to guard the citadel's smoking ruin. The rest he ordered back to the harbor. The entire city was now at their mercy, and there were other prizes to claim. The high tower still stood. The starry September had not yet been conquered, and the lords of the Reach might even now be riding to defend Oldtown. If so, Euron would meet them on ground of his choosing, or he would slip away by sea with the destruction he had wrought. There was no sorrow on his face, no hesitation. He gazed at the inferno behind him, as if feeding on its energy, then turned away. Some said they heard him softly humming a nameless tune beneath his breath, as if guided by some half-remembered melody from the ocean's depths. As the sun sank that second day, Oldtown was a city of nightmares. The southwestern wharves were battered, reeking of brine and decay. The approach to the citadel lay strewn with broken siege equipment, corpses, and debris. The citadel itself was wreathed in flames so large they could be seen from leagues away, belching black plumes of smoke and a hideous green glow that flared whenever a new stash of wildfire caught. Refugees clogged the streets leading north, some trying to flee through any city gate the Ironborn did not fully control. Families huddled in temple doorways or roamed the city's labyrinthine alleys, desperate for any news or path to safety. The once orderly squares and markets had turned into makeshift shelters or battle zones. The city watch could not be found in great numbers. Most had either died in the onslaught or retreated to guard certain enclaves. Fear reigned. Meanwhile, in the gloom of a half-collapsed tower at the edge of the citadel complex, a small group of maesters and novices had taken refuge. Their robes were dirty with ash and sweat. One novice bore a nasty cut across the forehead, partly wrapped in a scrap of linen. Another coughed wretchedly, his lungs scorched by the smoke. They huddled around a single flickering lantern, mindful of the raging inferno outside. Above them, the tower's top floors had caved in, leaving only a precarious shelter. Occasionally, a fresh shower of sparks or debris rained down through gaps in the ceiling. The heat was suffocating, and the stone walls radiated an oppressive warmth that threatened to cook them if they remained too long. Yet they could not flee easily. The tower's main stair was blocked by rubble, and the Ironborn roamed the courtyard beyond. One archmaester among them, an older man named Malachy, tried to remain calm, though tears stained the lines of his face. He clutched a small iron-bound coffer to his chest. Inside, pressed between carefully folded parchments, were a handful of extremely rare texts, records of ancient Valyria, a treatise on the children of the forest, a partial translation of a rumored prophecy from As-High. He had grabbed them in the chaos, determined that some fragment of the citadel's knowledge must survive. Other novices had snatched a few scrolls from scattered corners, but their entire haul was pitifully small. Compared to the endless vaults of the citadel, these scraps seemed like droplets from an ocean of lost lore. Still, droplets were better than nothing. They whispered among themselves about how to escape the city. Perhaps if they found a skiff in the canals, they could row out under the cover of night. Or maybe if they waited for the Tyrell cavalry or for House Redwine's fleet, rescue would come. Each time the novices repeated such hopes, Malachy peered through a crack in the wall, glimpsing the unholy glow of the wildfire and the savage shapes of Ironborn silhouettes. He saw no salvation, only ruin. But they clung to hope, for they had nothing else. They dared not so much as cough loudly, lest some reaver hear them and end their dreams. Farther across the city, near the base of the high tower itself, an assembly of Oldtown's remaining defenders sought to regroup. Lord Leighton Hightower, elderly and half-lost in his tower's labyrinth of chambers, had left the day-to-day command to his children and their knights. Word spread that the old lord, rumored to be deep in the study of arcane mysteries, was incensed by the citadel's destruction. Servants whispered that he cursed Euron's name and would see the Ironborn drowned. But his rage alone could not conjure an army. The defenders that remained were meager. Still, they barred the high tower's gates, readied the ballista on the upper ramparts, and prayed for reinforcements from the Reach. Many eyes peered out to sea, searching for white sails or green banners, some sign that help was on its way. Yet Euron commanded the waters now. The Iron Fleet's blockade prevented any direct approach by sea, and the southwestern roads were choked with chaos. A few houses in the Reach might have mustered men, but it would take time to march them. In that gap, Euron's reavers tore through Oldtown, seizing valuables, subduing pockets of resistance, and dragging those few maesters they caught out into the streets. The reavers took savage delight in humiliating the citadel's survivors. There were rumors of novices hung from signposts, chain links torn from archmasters' necks and worn as trophies. It all served the pirate lord's twisted design, to sow terror so deep that Oldtown would never truly recover, and that all Westeros would know his name. Amid the city's labyrinth of winding streets, a teenage acolyte named Duran managed to slip away from the carnage. He carried a single tattered volume pressed to his chest. It was a codex of genealogies, a dull subject for most, but ironically it listed lines of descent, alliances, and feudal obligations dating back centuries. He had been entrusted with it by his dying mentor, who insisted that the realm's memory must not be lost. Duran scuttled along back alleys, half choked by the smoke, his eyes wide with terror each time he heard ironborn boots clattering on cobblestones. Once, he hid behind a water trough while reavers drank from a cask of wine they'd pillaged. Their boisterous voices curled into the sooty air, and the boy prayed they would not notice him. Then they moved on, presumably to set another building aflame or search for more loot. Only then did Duran hurry onward. His skin was coated in grime, and the codex's leather cover was smudged, but it remained intact. Whenever fear threatened to break him, he recalled the old mentor's last words, "Keep the memory alive," so he kept moving. By the dawn of the third day, Oldtown was a city in partial ruin, though the High Tower, the Starry September, and certain northern districts still stood. The citadel was effectively gone. Some of its side buildings remained, but the library complex was a blackened shell. Fires continued to burn in pockets, though many had died down. The once proud spires that soared above the city's skyline had collapsed or were too damaged to be recognized. Smoke lingered over everything, turning the sun's early rays into a sickly red haze. The stench of charred wood and flesh was omnipresent. Citizens roamed like ghosts, eyes hollow. Many had lost family, homes, livelihoods, and the sense of certainty that Oldtown's grandeur once provided. At the city gates, the battered watch tried to keep order, but the roads were clogged with refugees seeking to flee, and with the approach of more ironborn from the harbor. In the hush that settled over the half-destroyed citadel courtyard, the remains of knowledge lay in heaps of ash, blackened scraps of parchment, broken spines of books, melted lumps of once precious glass from the reading lamps. A fierce glow still pulsed in the deeper recesses where pockets of wildfire lingered, though less fiercely than before. Once in a while, a gust of wind scattered gray flakes into the air like mock snow. No grand sum of gold could have replaced what was lost there. Treatises on healing, compendiums of Westerosi history, details of astronomy, rosters of battles, volumes of genealogical lore that established noble houses' claims, and far rarer works on the arcane that had been locked away for centuries. In one savage stroke, it was gone. And Euron Greyjoy? He reveled in it. He established a rough seat of power near the harbor, in a confiscated guild hall. He forced the local shipwrights to work for him, repairing or refitting some of his galleys that had taken damage in the assault. He took tribute from merchants who still clung to hope that bribery might spare them from plunder. At times, he would prowl the city in a small retinue, searching for pockets of defiance. No one was safe from his predatory gaze. Some nights, rumor claimed, he vanished into the darkness with small groups of loyal men, bound for the shattered remains of the citadel, or for the catacombs beneath Oldtown, exploring secret halls rumored to contain hidden artifacts. Others claimed he performed twisted rituals on the banks of the Honeywine, brandishing relics stolen from the maesters, calling upon powers that slithered in the deep. The truth was uncertain, but fear fed the rumors, making them potent. In the days that followed, the slow arrival of men from the Reach created scattered skirmishes. House Tarly, having mustered some forces, harried the outskirts of the city, hoping to cut off Euron's supply lines. Yet Euron had supplies enough in Oldtown, and the Tarly forces were not large enough to mount a full retaking. The best they managed was to hold back the Ironborn from pushing further inland. A stalemate of sorts arose, unsteady, dripping with the tension of potential further bloodshed. Meanwhile, the folk of Oldtown, battered by the invasion and the citadel's destruction, tried to survive. People found ways to trade, to pass messages, to share scraps of knowledge gleaned from the few surviving maesters hidden in cellars. But in truth, a darkness had settled over the city that was once the beacon of light in the realm. Outside the realm, when word finally spread that Oldtown had been sacked and that the Citadel's library had burned, shockwaves rippled across Westeros and beyond. No one could fully believe it at first. That seed of knowledge had seemed eternal. Even in the darkest times, the maesters had remained. Yeah? Ravens arrived with frantic messages describing the loss, the fires, the horror. Lords in the north and riverlands who had not directly felt Euron's wrath still felt a chill. Knowledge was not just the concern of dusty scholars. It propped up every corner of the realm. Laws, treaties, genealogies, the details of healing and harvest cycles, the intangible threads that bound Westeros together were threatened by the ashes drifting in Oldtown skies. In King's Landing, some said the Grand Maester collapsed upon hearing the news, while the king or regent, whoever held power in that particular hour of chaos, swore vengeance. Others cursed the maesters as having grown complacent. Yet none could deny that the realm was wounded. It would be years, decades, before any semblance of the Citadel's old knowledge could be pieced together. And that was assuming someone had managed to save fragments, to preserve the memory of the realm. If not, how many secrets had simply vanished, devoured by the green flames that Euron unleashed? Still, the winds of war continued to blow. Euron's men held Oldtown in a lethal grip, though cracks in their control formed over time as pockets of resistance grew bolder. Some said that if the Tyrell armies came in full force, Euron would not be able to hold. Others feared that the cunning pirate king had some darker design, that he cared little for the city's long-term occupation and might vanish back into the sea at the moment of his choosing, leaving behind ruin and chaos. The faithful in the starry September prayed for deliverance, for a miracle. But none could deny that the citadel was gone. Though the fires eventually died, leaving blackened rubble and a faint odor that lingered for months, the citadel was not salvageable. And so the days wore on. The city, half-ruined, persisted. The starving clung to life, the traumatized huddled in corners or fled to the countryside. Euron's men roamed, reaving, though smaller in number than the unstoppable wave that had first crashed upon Oldtown. Some died in drunken brawls, others fell to hidden blades in the night wielded by vigilantes. But the silence remained anchored in the harbor, a potent symbol of terror. At dusk, Euron could sometimes be seen at the prow, the dying light catching his single bright eye, the patch over the other rendering his face a mocking mask. He gazed across the water at the once mighty skyline, now jagged and crowned by the scorched ruin of the citadel. Sometimes he closed his eyes and murmured words no one could hear, perhaps conversing with the drowned gods or darker powers. Other times he simply smiled as if pleased by the devastation. If there was one flicker of hope, it rested in the small handful of maesters, novices, and determined townsfolk who had managed to salvage scraps of texts and memories. Here a hidden chest contained the last known copy of a treatise on crop rotation. There a novice carried genealogies. In a cellar near the starry September, an old scholar trembling with age recited from memory entire sections of the seven-pointed star, ensuring that the faith's lore would remain intact even if the printed volumes were destroyed. Scattered across the city, men and women risked their lives to preserve what they could to hide away relics from the Ironborn's wrath. In the end, though, these fragments could never equal the Citadel's total wealth of knowledge. So much was lost in those short days of fire. The realm would feel the echo for generations. Over time, perhaps new libraries would rise, new books would be written to try to replace the old. But the immediate effect was a void, a tear in Westeros's tapestry of learning. As for Euron Greyjoy's ultimate fate, the songs that sprang from those desperate days could not agree on a single conclusion. Some say that he eventually took to the seas again, slipping away with his iron fleet when word reached him that the Tyrell host was drawing near. Others insist he stayed longer, searching among the Citadel's catacombs for some dark artifact, a relic that might give him dominion over the storms or open a path to the blackest magics. A few said he was eventually challenged by a company of knights who somehow seized the initiative and drove him out with cunning tactics. But in each version, the destructive deed remained. Oldtown was scarred forever, and the Citadel's library was no more. Perhaps, in years to come, the city would rebuild. The maesters who survived would try to gather new volumes to teach the novices who had lost everything in the blaze. But no matter how many stones were set or how many new shelves were erected, they could not truly restore what had been obliterated in those days of smoke and terror. Every time a new volume was bound and placed on a shelf, someone would recall the grand library that once was, the silver keys that unlocked the restricted sections, the echo of footsteps in halls of quiet reflection. The old men bent over candlelit desks recording the realm's knowledge. The destruction of that sanctuary of learning was a tragedy unlike any other, a wound to the mind and spirit of Westeros that might never fully heal. At the vantage of history, bards would sing of that time as one of infamy. They told of Euron Greyjoy's cruelty, of the black sails of the silence blotting out the horizon. They told of brave defenders who fell in vain, of heartbreak and the unstoppable tide of wildfire that consumed the proudest storehouse of knowledge in the world. Yet they also sang of the survivors' determination, of the scraps saved from the flames, of the hidden seeds of knowledge that could one day sprout anew. Generations later, children in the streets of some distant city might hear a minstrel and wonder if it was just a story, a fable about the dangers of letting one man hold such power. But for the people who lived through it, who saw the walls fall, the books burn, and heard the voices of the dying, it was all too real. On the final day that Euron walked among the blackened ruins of the citadel, ash drifting around him like dark snow, he placed his hand against one broken pillar. The heat of the fires still radiated from the stones. He leaned in and laughed quietly. A soft, rasping chuckle with no warmth. Then he turned to his men and gestured them to follow, boots crunching on charred remains of knowledge. They left behind them the hush of a tomb for the realm's memory. If that memory could one day be reborn, it would only be because scattered souls had cared enough to preserve a fraction of what once was. But for now, in that moment, the silence of the citadel was drowned by the roars of the wildfire's aftermath, and Euron Greyjoy disappeared into that swirling haze of victory and ruin, never to be forgotten by the living or the dead. Euron Greyjoy left the scorched courtyard of the citadel in the same manner he had arrived, striding through ruin as if it were merely a stage set for his drama. Flames still raged behind him, though not with the same all-consuming fury as before. They had settled into a steady, ravenous burn, devouring every last scrap of knowledge that centuries of maesters had so diligently amassed. Only the occasional collapse of a half-broken tower or the dull thud of falling masonry punctuated the ominous roar of fire. Dense gray-black smoke rose to the heavens, a sullen column marking the heart of Oldtown's devastation. The acrid reek of wildfire still clung to the air, underscored by the stench of burned parchment and charred flesh. He paused at the splintered main gate, turning once to observe the swirling currents of ash drifting across the shattered marble steps. Green-hued embers glimmered among the debris, and for a moment he watched them with the fascination of a child at a puppet show. Then, with a little shrug, he turned again and strode down the ramp where a gaggle of his men awaited. They looked tired, sooty, flecked with the blood of their enemies. But their eyes shone with the same dark thrill that animated their captain. They had accomplished the unimaginable. The citadel, seat of learning in Westeros, lay in ruins. He said nothing. At his back, the library towers belched their last howls as if screaming in mortal agony. His reavers took that silence as permission to follow. Some cast final glances of triumph at the blazing wreck behind them. Others scowled, uneasy about the chance that the wildfire might yet flare and catch them in its hungry maw. But Euron led on, free of fear. He walked as though the flames parted for him alone, and in their zeal his men believed it might be true. They passed through a section of the citadel's outer complex, collapsed arches, rubble-strewn courtyards that had escaped the direct blasts but not the aftermath. Bodies lay where they had fallen, some in twisted shapes that spoke of a violent end. A novice with a crushed skull still clutched the broken handle of a sword. A maester's chain, snapped into individual links, glinted on the ground. Some reavers rifled through corpses for valuables, yanking silver rings off bloated fingers or rummaging in pouches for coin. Euron paid them no mind. He strode on, lost in his own silent reverie until the citadel walls gave way to the city's devastated streets. Smoke had settled thickly over Oldtown. The sky was a hazy smear of brown and red, as though even the sun had been stained with blood. Here and there, the narrower alleys remained mercifully intact, but the southwestern quarter was little more than a graveyard of timbers and collapsed rooftops. An unsettling stillness reigned, broken only by the occasional shriek or wail from someone left wounded in a building. Euron's men systematically turned each corner, looking for fresh conquests, or else menacing any cowering survivors for gleanings. Nothing large remained to loot. They'd had days of near-total dominion, and the city had been bled almost dry. Yet they searched nonetheless, like dogs turning over old bones just in case scraps of meat remained. They arrived at a wide intersection near the remains of an ancient fountain. It once featured carved stone dolphins spouting crystal water, but now the basin was empty and cracked, stained with soot. The dolphins had lost their heads in the chaotic destruction, and a broken spear jutted from the center. Enough of Euron's men were waiting here to form a small camp, tarred tents repurposed from sales, a handful of supply wagons stolen from local merchants, a cage of sorry-looking prisoners. The prisoners' eyes were wide with terror at the Reavers' approach. They had already endured 3 days of horror, and many knew that Euron had offered neither quarter nor mercy to the city's defenders. Why these few remained alive was a question best left unasked. When Euron appeared, the men called out to him, uncertain if they should cheer in the face of his silence. The Reavers parted to let him pass, kneeling their heads or gripping weapons more tightly in crude deference. He gestured imperiously with 2 fingers for someone to fetch him drink, and soon a battered pewter mug of ale was shoved into his hand. He raised it to his lips, took a slow swallow, and then tossed the vessel aside, letting it clatter into the dust. At length, one of his captains, Harrag Salteye, a scarred Ironborn with a braided beard, bowed his head and spoke. "The city yields less each day, Crow's Eye," he said, using the name Ironborn men had for Euron. "The people hide or flee beyond the walls. We can raid them still, but we risk losing men if we push too far east. Tarly's outriders harass us. They're cunning." Euron said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, he murmured, "Let them come. Tarly is no fool, but I have use of the city still. And if the Tyrell forces muster, we will greet them like a hammer greets a seashell." Harrag's lips twisted, uncertain, but he bowed again. Another of the Reavers approached and informed Euron that 2 ships had taken damage from an unexpected scuffle at the harbor mouth. Remnants of the local garrison had tried to break out in a fishing vessel, rigged with casks of oil and set ablaze to damage the blockade. The sabotage had partially succeeded, though not enough to cripple the Iron Fleet. Euron barely blinked at the news. He only said, "We lost men." "A handful," the Reaver admitted, "but we cut the saboteurs apart. And we still hold the harbor solid." Euron nodded as though that were all that mattered. He turned his one good eye on the cage of prisoners. A middle-aged man in a torn cloak, presumably a merchant or moneylender, shrank back from the bars. Next to him, a trembling boy of about 11 tried to avert his gaze, a mixture of soot and tears streaking his cheeks. Euron watched them for a moment. The merchant stammered, "Please, my lord. I have silver. In a hidden strongbox. Spare my boy, I beg you." Euron blinked once, slowly, then looked at Harrag. "See if he speaks the truth," he said with an icy calm. "If so, let him show you. Take the silver. Do what you will with the rest." Though the merchant's pleas grew frantic, Euron walked past, paying no more heed to the cage or the boy. The men parted for him again, and he led a contingent back toward the docks, meandering through the city's wide southwestern roads. This area, once the bustling life of Oldtown's trade, was now an Ironborn stronghold. Ruined storehouses, burnt taverns, and looted shops lined each side of the avenue. More black banners bearing the Kraken crest of House Greyjoy flapped here and there. Trophies of conquest hammered to doorways or hung from poles. The local watch had long since collapsed, except for a few pockets that stubbornly resisted or tried to sabotage the Reavers. Euron's presence snuffed out any illusions of resistance in the open. He reached the keys. The silence rode the water like a nightmare made real. Despite the ash-laden air, her hull still gleamed with ominous carvings, the figurehead shaped like a drowned maiden twisted in agony. Her sails were partially furled. Nearby, other Ironborn ships lay at anchor, forming a blockade that no one in the city could hope to break. Only narrow fishing craft dared slip along the edges of the harbor, and many had been seized by Euron's men. The reek of fish and brine mingled with the pervasive odor of smoke and decay. On the far side of the wide harbor channel rose the tall Hightower, shining beacon extinguished. The structure had not been sacked, for House Hightower and its defenders still held it. Euron gazed upon it from time to time with faint amusement. He had ravaged the citadel, left the southwestern quarter in flames, yet that proud tower on its rocky outcrop remained upright, defying him. Some nights, archers on the high walls launched arrows at passing Reavers. Men had died, their bodies slipping into the black water below. Yet Euron had not moved to destroy the high tower. Perhaps he found sport in leaving it as a challenge, or maybe a future trophy. His men occasionally muttered that the high towers were said to have powerful alliances. There was talk of House Redwine's fleet. Still, Euron dismissed these concerns with a wave of his hand, as if confident no one would stand against him in time. He stood on the pier, letting the gulls' cries wash over him. Then, with a deep breath, he turned to the men at his back. "The city is ripe for one last reaping," he said softly. "Take what remains, break what you can't carry. Let them starve or cower, but do not linger in small groups. Tarly's scouts pick off stragglers. Move in force. Return here each sundown." The men nodded and dispersed, well used to taking orders from the Crow's Eye, even if those orders ushered them toward relentless violence. As they marched off, Euron lingered, scanning the horizon. The thick haze overhead made the day feel like perpetual twilight. He thought of the citadel's secrets now drifting skyward in ashes. His lips twitched in something resembling a smile. He had undone centuries of the Maester's hoarding. Whether he had gleaned any real arcane power from that destruction was another matter. The truths he sought he had told no one might lie deeper still in the labyrinth of vaults beneath Oldtown or in legends that extended beyond the writing of mere men. He withdrew to his ship with a measured stride, leaving Oldtown to quake under the boot of the Iron Fleet. Across the city, smaller stories unfolded in quiet corners, each a testament to either resilience or despair. In the half-collapsed tower near the citadel's outer walls, Archmaester Malachi and his small band of survivors huddled in the choking heat. They dared not light a fresh torch. The glow could alert any passing reavers who had reason to search the rubble. Instead, Malachi kept a single shutter in the ruined stone open, letting a few dusty strands of daylight creep inside. The novices clung to water skins that were almost empty. None had eaten more than stale crusts in 2 days. Malachi's hair and beard were singed, his face smeared with soot. He looked older than his years, stooped and coughing, but he still refused to abandon his iron-bound coffer. Within it lay those few parchments he had salvaged, scraps of knowledge that might one day serve as a seed for rebuilding. The novices, exhausted, eyed him with a mixture of hope and resignation. Every so often, the tower quivered as another piece of the citadel's foundation fell. But for now, the ruin still held them in its precarious embrace. At midday, a faint rumbling from outside made them go stiff with fear. Raising himself on shaky legs, Malachi peered through the shattered stones. In the distance, a handful of Ironborn roamed the courtyard, axes slung over their shoulders. They seemed to be searching for anything left unburnt, but the once glorious fortress offered little but piles of scorched debris. One reaver poked a blackened staff into the rubble, turning up cinders as if hoping to find silver or coin hidden beneath the ruin. Another spat and gestured for them to move on. Soon, they vanished deeper into the complex. Malachi lowered himself, stifling a cough. "They will not look forever," he whispered. "But we cannot remain here much longer. We'll roast or starve." A novice named Oswald nodded in grim agreement. "We should slip out by night, Archmaester. There's a gap in the rubble along the west side. If we can reach the river's edge, we might find a boat or a place to wade across." "Wade across?" hissed another novice, Davin, who clutched a wounded arm. "You think the reavers won't be watching for that? They have archers on the walls near the quays." Malachi closed his eyes, feeling tears threaten. He had been a man of reason all his life, carefully penning treatises, tutoring novices, never expecting to face a day like this. "Better a risk than this slow death," he said. "We must keep moving." After a moment, the others inclined their heads. They would follow him, or at least they saw no other chance. With trembling hands, they began gathering what little they possessed: the coffer, a few waterskins, a small knife, and a single half-broken crossbow. If they were discovered, they knew it would scarcely be enough to protect them. But in that silent tower, the last vestige of the citadel's survivors resolved to make their escape as soon as twilight might shield them. Not far away, in the labyrinth of Oldtown's narrow streets, a teenage acolyte named Euron scrambled over the remains of a collapsed wagon, sweat dripping from his brow. He was alone, clutching the genealogical codex he had rescued from the burning library. He had escaped a patrol of Ironborn the day before, crawling under a dead horse when they passed. Each new hour of survival was a minor miracle. There was little food, little water, and less safety. But the memory of his mentor's final words, "Keep the memory alive," spurred him onward. He made his way through back alleys, stepping around piles of rubble. The codex was hidden under his tunic, tied against his chest so his hands could remain free. He wondered if the genealogies were worth the struggle. How many families remained to care about lines of descent now that Oldtown itself was in flames? Yet he clung to the volume. Some intangible sense of duty refused to let him abandon it. A true acolyte would protect the realm's knowledge or die trying. Near a crumbled stable, he saw shapes move. Alarmed, he ducked behind a broken cart. Then he heard voices, hushed, anxious, but speaking in the common tongue without an Ironborn accent. Peering around the splintered wood, he spotted 3 men wearing partial livery of the city watch. Soot-stained and clearly exhausted, they seemed to be rummaging for salvage. They had a small sack and were placing dried oats or some other meager supplies into it, presumably for themselves or for the few survivors they protected. Summoning courage, Euron emerged with one hand raised. "Don't shoot," he whispered. I was a novice at the Citadel. I mean you no harm." The watchmen whirled, startled. One readied a short sword, but upon seeing the youth, they lowered it warily. "Gods be good," muttered a guard with an unkempt beard. "Did any of you survive that hell back there?" Euron swallowed hard. "Some. Not many. I got out before the library, the flames he couldn't finish. The memory was still raw. The watchman surveyed him a moment more. Then the oldest nodded. We're not your enemy. But be warned, the Ironborn prowl these streets. They'll kill you for sport if they find you. Or worse. He cast a glance at the other two men. We've been trying to gather supplies for families holed up near the starry September. It's not safe anywhere, but we do what we can. Something like relief flooded Darren's chest. Can I go with you? I have something important. He touched his tunic where the codex was hidden. The watchmen exchanged glances, then nodded. In times of crisis, it seemed alliances formed quickly. They set off together. The older watchman introduced himself as Ser Lars Upton, once a sworn sword of House Hightower. The other two were Beric and Will, commoners pressed into the watch who had refused to yield even when the Ironborn overwhelmed the city. Doran felt a surge of gratitude for them, a flicker of hope. Perhaps they could find a place to hide, to gather more survivors until the Tyrells or Tarleys arrived in full force. The watchman knew the city's lesser-known ways, old passages beneath certain houses, a discreet walkway behind the starry September that had once been used for ceremonial processions. With luck, they might slip past Reaver patrols. For the next hour, the small group crept through quiet lanes, halting whenever they heard footfalls or raucous laughter that signaled Ironborn. They navigated half-destroyed workshops, hopped a wall into a manor's courtyard, and pressed themselves against soot-stained gates, listening for any sign of trouble. Twice, they almost stumbled upon Reavers rummaging for loot. Each time, they held their breath and prayed the next corner wouldn't reveal a black-sailed captain with an axe. Eventually, they reached the starry September surroundings. The building itself, a masterpiece of ancient craftsmanship, had been spared the worst of the flames so far. It stood, defiant and tall, even though the city around it smoldered. Its 7 crystal towers were stained with soot, but some faint radiance remained where sunlight struck the highest windows. At the base, a cluster of refugees milled, guarded by a handful of the faith militant or other defenders. The Septons had done what they could to house the wounded. Blankets littered the stone steps, and the smell of blood and sweat mingled with candle smoke. Darren's heart twisted at the sight, old men and women, children, the injured who moaned softly. Hope wavered in his chest. He wondered if it was wise to bring more bodies into a place that might be targeted next. But Ser Lars insisted that the starry September was the best temporary sanctuary. Many folks have flocked here. The Reavers have kept their distance for now. They fear the faith might have hidden swords or that more watchmen gather here. Cautiously, they approached. A sister of the faith recognized Ser Lars and ushered them in, leading them through the broad doors which were barred from within by a hasty barricade of benches. Candles flickered in the vast interior. The marble floor was scuffed with footprints, dried mud, and dark stains. Overhead, the grand dome soared, painted with images of the 7, though the pictures were dimmed by drifting smoke that seeped through the cracked windows. At the far end, near the altar, a cluster of wounded lay on straw pallets. 2 silent sisters and a young Septon hurried about, tending as best they could. Doran felt an aching sadness. The faith possessed no magical healing, only rudimentary means of bandaging wounds and offering comfort. Surviving maesters might have improved matters, but so many were dead or scattered. The city's structure was undone. He saw a mother rocking a crying child whose eyes were bandaged, likely burned by the conflagration or an Ironborn torch. Others simply hunched against the walls, vacant stares suggesting they could not fathom how their city had fallen so thoroughly. The Watchers of the Sept recognized Darren's novice robes beneath the soot. Wordless, they beckoned him to a corner where a few battered crates served as seats. Ser Lars parted ways, off to speak with some of the men who tried to coordinate defense. Beric and Will vanished to distribute the meager supplies. Left alone, Doran set the genealogical codex aside on a crate and closed his eyes. Everything felt surreal, as though he had stumbled into a nightmare that refused to end. In the hush of the Sept, muffled sobs mingled with whispered prayers. Occasionally, a distant cry or the crash of rubble outside pierced the silence. A Septon approached him, an older man with a lined face and kind eyes. He wore the simple robes of his calling, but the sleeves were dark with soot. He introduced himself as Septon Rassin. "You were one of the Citadel's boys?" he asked softly. Doran nodded. The Septon's gaze dropped to the codex, half visible under Darren's arm. "Do you carry knowledge from the library?" Doran hesitated. "Only genealogies. I don't even know if it's worth anything now, but it's what I could save." Septon Rassin's expression was gentle. "All knowledge is worth something," he murmured. "We must preserve whatever scraps we can. I've been taking down the names of survivors, writing them in a ledger. We lost so many records, so many good folk. If we can recall their names, that is a beginning. One day it may matter again. Warmth spread in Darren's chest, a fragile flicker in the sea of despair. He nodded. The Septon patted him on the shoulder and moved away to attend to a wounded woman. Duran set the codex in his lap, running a finger over its leather cover. Perhaps it was not so futile after all. The next 2 days passed in a haze of tension. Euron's men tightened their grip on the southwestern districts, launching sporadic raids toward the center of the city. They wrecked taverns, chased down any defenders foolish enough to confront them, and dragged captives off to uncertain fates. Yet they left the starry September largely untouched. Rumor said Euron believed that destroying a seat of the faith might awaken the wrath of too many lords, or that he simply preferred to see the faith cower in fear. Another rumor whispered that Euron wanted to carve the starry September's wealth from behind the altars in a grand spectacle, but was biding his time. In truth, no one knew. Euron's desires were an enigma even to his own men. Resistance coalesced in small, scattered pockets. The watchmen of Oldtown, once a respectable city guard, had been decimated, but the survivors joined with local men sworn to House Hightower, as well as knights who had come in from minor houses in the Reach, trying to unify. They communicated through runners who snuck from street to street. Many of these men sheltered in cellars or secure courtyards, blocking entrances with rubble, venturing out only in squads to ambush isolated reavers. Though these ambushes inflicted stinging losses, they did little to break the Ironborn's hold. Euron's men were too numerous and too motivated by his unholy charisma, especially with the silence towering in the harbor, a promise of seaborne escape if the city at large rose in force. From atop the high tower itself, watchers using old mirrors tried to signal across the harbor, scanning for any incoming sails with Tyrell or red wine sigils. They saw only black water and haze. A pitying gloom descended on those defenders. Food stocks ran thin. Small fishing sculls that tried to slip out by night were often caught by the blockade or ended up floating ablaze in the harbor. More refugees clogged the northern roads, seeking passage into the Reach, but House Tarly's outriders, keen to contain the threat, allowed only a trickle out lest the Ironborn slip away disguised among refugees. The situation grew dire. The city, once a beacon of trade and knowledge, teetered on the brink of total collapse. On the edges of that collapse, Malachy and his band made their move. Night had settled over the citadel ruins, the starless sky choked by a curtain of drifting smoke. The flames that had once blazed so fiercely in the library towers were diminished now, though pockets of fire and glowing embers dotted the wreckage. Carefully, quietly, Malachy led his novices through the tower's blocked stairwell, inching around fallen beams and broken stones. Their progress was excruciatingly slow. Any misstep could bring part of the ruin crashing down on them. Their eyes stung from lingering smoke, and their throats ached with thirst. They slipped into an adjacent hallway that had partially collapsed. The floor canted at a dangerous angle, forcing them to brace themselves against scorched walls. Through a gap, they glimpsed the courtyard once dominated by wildfire's monstrous bloom. Now it was a scorched basin littered with rubble, bits of melted chain, and the blackened remains of men who had perished in the explosion. Even the slightest breath of wind carried the bitter memory of that carnage. Malachy gestured for silence. He clutched his coffer in one hand, and with the other he steadied himself against a fractured column. Oswald took the lead, creeping forward with the crossbow raised, though it had only a single quarrel. Davin and 2 others followed, eyes darting left and right, hearts thudding like thunder in their ears. They heard voices echoing from somewhere beyond the courtyard, a couple of Ironborn discussing the day's plunder. One reaver sounded half-drunk, laughing at some crude jest. The novices froze in place, scarcely daring to breathe. The voices drifted closer, then receded. At last, Malachy mouthed, "Go." Now. One by one, they descended a sloping section of rubble into what had once been a side garden. Tall walls of cracked stone loomed on every side. Any semblance of greenery had burned to cinders. Their boots crunched as they advanced, though they tried to be silent. Twice, Oswald raised a hand, signaling them to crouch. They heard footsteps, hoarse laughter again. Then quiet. Slowly they pressed on. A small archway yawned at the garden's far edge, partially blocked by a tangle of stone blocks and charred vines. Beyond that arch lay the city's outer lanes, or so Malachy hoped. They had no certainty what they might find, but to remain in the citadel was certain death. One of the novices cleared away debris with careful movements. The stones shifted, making an alarming noise, but none of the novices dared stop now. Finally, the gap widened enough for them to slip through. Oswald ducked out first, crossbow at the ready. Malachy was next, hoisting the coffer with trembling arms. The other novices followed. They emerged into a narrow passage that ran parallel to the citadel's southern perimeter. This place had not escaped the fire, scorch marks streaked the walls, and abandoned carts lay broken in the path. But it was deserted. Overhead, the night was mercifully dark. Soundlessly, they hurried along, hearts pounding. At every corner, they paused, listening. Far in the distance, the flicker of torchlight suggested Reaver patrols. The novices moved slowly, creeping from shadow to shadow, determined to put as much distance as they could between themselves and the wrecked citadel. Malachi's head swam with exhaustion. His mouth felt like sand, but the coffer remained clutched in his grip. Within it lay precious scraps, nothing compared to the library's lost troves, yet in these desperate times it felt like an entire kingdom's fortune. They continued through the winding streets, stepping around debris from collapsed houses. Oldtown's southwestern quarter was a wasteland of blackened timber and rubble. No watch patrols came to aid them, no one was left here but the ghosts of the slaughtered. By the time they reached a small intersection near the remnants of a wooden shrine, Malachi could hardly stand. His legs shook. One novice, a boy of perhaps 15, took the coffer from him to give him relief. The Archmaester whispered his gratitude, forcing his feet onward. They ventured deeper into the city. Eventually, they saw the faint glow of a brazier near what looked like a temple facade and the flicker of movement. Terrified it might be Ironborn, they attempted to skirt around by taking a side alley. But they soon discovered the alley was blocked by collapsed masonry. Trapped, they had two choices: go back the way they came, which risked running into Reavers behind them, or move forward and risk discovery by whoever manned that brazier. Oswald's face tightened. "Let me scout. If it's Reavers, I'll signal and we run." Malachi nodded wearily. He clutched the younger man's shoulder, murmuring a quiet prayer to whatever gods might listen. Oswald set the crossbow at half-cock and moved away, hugging the walls. For a long moment, the novices hovered in fearful silence, half expecting to hear the clang of metal or a shout of alarm. Instead, Oswald returned with wide eyes and beckoned them onward. They followed, hearts racing. In the brazier's glow, they saw a tall man with a battered helm that bore the sigil of House Hightower. He held a spear, but he did not brandish it at them. Instead, he regarded them with a wary, guarded expression. Two other men in partial armor stood behind him, near the half-intact columns of what must have been a shrine to the Seven. The novices exchanged quick glances, then Malachi stepped forward. "I am Archmaester Malachi of the Citadel," he whispered, voice rough, though there is little left of it now. The guard's eyes flickered with recognition. "We heard rumors. We thought no one survived there." His voice had a subdued tremor, as though the destruction of the Citadel pained him as much as any. "Are you fleeing the city?" "We are seeking refuge," Malachi answered. "Do you know of a safe place?" "The Starry September, perhaps?" At the mention of the Sept, the guard grimaced. "Safer than most, but nothing is truly safe now. My orders are to guide any survivors to a forward outpost near the Street of Looms. Our Lord's men are regrouping for a possible push. If you come, you can at least share rations." The novices exchanged glances. The notion of a push seemed laughable given the scale of Euron's conquest. But any allied force was better than wandering alone in these haunted streets. Malachi nodded. "Show us the way." The guard gestured for them to follow. With the novices in tow, the small group passed through a row of half-burned buildings. At one corner, they saw the body of a child face down in a puddle of muddy water. No one spoke. They had seen too many horrors in recent days. They pressed on, trying to banish the images of death that surrounded them. Before long, they reached what the guard called the Street of Looms, once known for its cloth merchants and weavers. The reek of smoke was thick here, but a few structures still stood. A battered sign above a door read Manticore threads, the letters scorched. The guard led them around back, to a yard enclosed by a stout stone wall. Inside, they discovered a ragged assembly of men. Some wore tabards bearing House Hightower's beacon sigil. Others bore simpler gear. A knight sat near a broken crate, adjusting a bandage on his thigh. At the center of the yard, a brazier glowed, with a single pot of what smelled like boiled onions or turnips. It was a meager gathering, but it felt more like companionship than anything Malachi had experienced in days. They recognized the novices' citadel robes. Whispers broke out, some men crossing themselves or uttering a quick prayer. A knight approached and introduced himself as Ser Emmon Beesbury, a retainer sworn to the Hightowers. He explained that they had been stationed here for 2 days, gathering anyone they could and scouring side streets for reavers. They had a few successes in fending off small patrols, but nothing that could stand against a concentrated Ironborn assault. "Still," Ser Emin said, "we do what we can. If Tarly or the Redwines arrive, we'll coordinate. Until then, at least you have a roof, meager as it is." Malachi's legs nearly gave way. Oswald kept him upright, and 2 other men assisted him to a spot by the fire. The novices settled in a cluster, grateful for warmth, despite the reek of acrid smoke that lingered on the breeze. A few men offered them sips of water and bits of hard biscuit. The novices devoured them in silence. Malachi felt tears prick his eyes. So much devastation, yet these men still found charity. He murmured shaky thanks, then carefully set his coffer beside him, mindful of its contents. As the night wore on, the battered group exchanged stories. Many had lost kin. Some recounted how the Ironborn roared through the southwestern gate, unstoppable. Others had glimpsed Euron personally, describing the unnerving glimmer in his single visible eye. A hush fell whenever the destruction of the citadel was mentioned. At last, Ser Emin asked Malachi if any part of the library remained. The Archmaester replied with a hollow look, shaking his head. "Ashes," he said simply. "The G. Reedus Trove in the known world, gone." A few men shivered. It was no idle matter to see centuries of knowledge vanish overnight. One asked if the Targaryen conquest or the Blackfire Rebellion had ever threatened the citadel so thoroughly, but the answer was known. Never had it been so wholly ravaged. The old pillars might stand in some skeletal form, but the knowledge was lost. At this, a wave of anger coursed through the men, anger at Euron, at the realm's tardy lords, at their own helplessness. Even if they survived this invasion, a part of Westeros's soul was gone. In the small hours of the morning, Malachi dozed, head lolling against the coffer. He dreamed fitfully of burning shelves and books with screaming faces. When dawn broke, it brought only a wan, sickly light that filtered through Oldtown's perpetual haze. The group stirred to meager rations, sips of weak ale, scraps of dried fish. Then they set about fortifying the yard's perimeter, stacking broken barrels and tables near the wall, hoping to form a rudimentary barricade. Ser Emin, limping, directed them. Malachi and the novices helped as best they could, though the Archmaester's frailty limited him. They all knew it was but a temporary measure. If the Ironborn arrived in force, no barricade of barrels would hold them back. Yet the act gave them a sense of purpose. Constructing something, however small, pushed against the relentless tide of destruction. In that yard, the seeds of resistance found fragile soil. Meanwhile, across the city, Euron's men roved. They had discovered by now that the city was wrung dry of immediate loot. The southwestern quarter was a ruin, and any hidden troves of wealth had been either spirited away to the High Tower or the Starry September, or buried so well that only locals knew of them. Frustration brewed among some reavers who had expected greater spoils. They had piles of coins, jewelry, and valuables from the first days of the sack, but after so many savage raids, Oldtown gave up no more. The men grew restless, thirsting for further plunder or new targets. A handful of brawls erupted among the Ironborn themselves, knives flashing over trivial disputes. Euron's black presence alone kept them from scattering. He prowled the quays or perched in the commandeered guild hall that served as his shore base, examining half-burned parchment stolen from the citadel's remains. Most were worthless to him, treatises on healing, discussions of astronomy, genealogical logs. He threw them asideboard. Rumor claimed he sought something darker, secrets of necromancy or references to forbidden lore from Ass High or Valyria. If these existed in the citadel, the flames had likely devoured them. Still, from time to time, Euron retired to the hold of the silence with an expression of quiet calculation, as if listening for a voice that drifted on the wind. On the 5th day after the citadel's fall, one of Euron's scouts brought word that a Tyrell banner had been spotted to the northeast. A small vanguard, not the main force, but enough to make trouble if it crept closer. They were said to be led by some lesser Tyrell cousin carrying the golden rose upon green. Euron did not stir from his seat. He merely nodded, swirling wine in a silver goblet. "Let them come," he said softly. "We still hold the city. They can't assault Oldtown walls easily, not unless they want to burn it themselves." His lips curved. "If we must, we'll meet them on the field." Behind him, the reaver who had brought the news bowed awkwardly and backed away. Euron's unflinching poise unnerved even his own men. If he feared the Tyrells, he gave no sign. Possibly he intended to slip away with the Iron Fleet before the main host arrived. Possibly he had other designs. In either case, the tension in Oldtown climbed higher, as if the city itself were an anvil about to be struck again. 3 days later, the watchers at the high tower glimpsed sails on the horizon. They were not the black sails of the Ironborn, but nor were they the pale wine-colored sails of House Red Wine. The watchers saw glints of gold in the midday sun and fluttering green banners. A flurry of speculation ran through the defenders. The Tyrell relief fleet? Or mercenaries in service to the Reach? News traveled slowly in these chaotic times. Some swore they spotted the golden rose on a shield. Others believed it was some alliance of lesser lords come by sea to outmaneuver the blockade. But how they intended to outfight the Iron Fleet was unclear. Word reached Euron quickly. He strode to the top of a watchtower at the harbor's edge, a battered structure that once served as a customs office. There, he peered through a Myrish lens, stolen from the citadel before the library's total destruction. The lens revealed a cluster of ships, not large, perhaps a dozen cogs or galleys, some heavier than others. Their sails bore motifs reminiscent of the Tyrell sigil, but Euron noticed subtle differences in each. Likely bannermen, he thought, forging a makeshift fleet. They were still distant, but they would soon close on Oldtown's harbor. Would they dare a direct fight with the Iron Fleet? Euron doubted it. Unless they had somehow gleaned a trick from the Targaryens' old pyromancers, they would find themselves outmatched by the Ironborn's mastery of the waves. He smiled, lowering the lens. Perhaps a naval slaughter was precisely what he craved. Another chance to demonstrate that even the great houses could not stand against him. The memory of King's Landing's wildfire fiasco flickered in his mind. He had unleashed that same power on the citadel, and the realm trembled. Let these lesser banners see what awaited them. He descended the tower and roused his captains. The docks bustled with new energy. Ironborn scrambled to man the ships, to arm the scorpions and ballistae that had been hastily mounted on a few decks. Men sharpened axes, bristling at the promise of another battle. Euron spoke few words, but each landed like a hammer. They come to challenge us at sea. Show them what it means to face the Iron Fleet. Let the whispering waves drink their blood. An hour later, the blockade spread out to meet the oncoming ships. Euron took his place aboard the Silence, standing at the prow, cloak rippling in the breeze. He watched the city recede behind him as the rowers plied their oars. The once proud skyline was a battered silhouette marred by black ruin. Even from here, one could see the crippled skeleton of the citadel's highest tower. The battered city fortifications huddled under a smoky pall. Euron felt a swell of dark satisfaction. Let the men on those Tyrell ships stare at what he had accomplished. Let it make them quake. The day was warm, though the air carried the tang of ash from the city's smoldering districts. The sea beyond the harbor mouth was choppy, an omen of foul weather to come. Euron relished the idea. A storm would not deter him. The Silence glided effortlessly, flanked by sister ships flying kraken banners. Black hulls cut the waves, iron-tipped rams gleaming in the midday sun. On the horizon, the small Tyrell-led flotilla slowed, perhaps recognizing that they faced a formidable foe. Euron raised a hand to shade his eye, scanning for any sign of stealth or trickery. The winds carried only the sharp tang of salt. A hush seemed to fall over both fleets as they drew closer, the water between them shrinking. The Tyrell ships were dwarfed by the Ironborn's numbers, but that did not necessarily mean a bloodless rout. Some of the enemy galleys looked well-built, with high sides and well-armed decks. Banners snapped in the breeze, green roses, golden fields, smaller sigils of lesser lords sworn to Highgarden. Euron sensed their fear. He could almost taste it on the wind. Without ceremony, the Iron Fleet advanced. Horns blared from the Silence. Crossbowmen and archers knocked bolts. The Tyrell ships responded in kind, battered horns bleeding out a discordant note. Perhaps their lords truly believed they might break the blockade, or perhaps they planned a sacrificial feint. Euron had seen many ploys in his time. With a laugh that carried over the waves, he gestured forward. The Ironborn needed no further urging. The first volley of arrows soared overhead, black specks flitting across the bright sky. The two fleets clashed. The Tyrell ships tried to maintain a line, but the Iron Fleet's forward galleys pierced that line with savage rams, smashing hulls and sending men tumbling into the sea. Arrows and spears flew in all directions. Men screamed as steel bit flesh. Euron guided the Silence into a graceful pivot, letting her scorpions unleash a barrage of heavy bolts. One embedded in the stern of the largest Tyrell vessel, the water rose, punching a hole in its timbers. Water surged in. The men aboard scrambled, cursing, while Ironborn reavers flung grapnels over the side to pull the stricken ship closer. The Silence's crew leapt across, howling in delight, and the deck became a slaughterhouse of clashing steel. On the far side of the battle, a smaller Tyrell cog broke away, trying to skirt the Ironborn's formation. They had chosen to run, seeking to circle behind or perhaps flee entirely. But a Reaver longship closed in with terrifying speed. The men aboard the cog hurled barrels of flaming oil, hoping to repel the boarders. The Reavers responded with crossbow bolts. Within moments, the smaller ship was ablaze, sailors throwing themselves into the churning sea. No mercy awaited them in the waves. The Ironborn speared men in the water with long hooks. Euron reveled in the chaos. He strode across the Water Rose's deck, stepping over corpses, striking down any who defied him. A Tyrell knight in partial plate lunged with a longsword, but Euron parried with a casual flick of his blade, then drove a dagger under the man's visor. Hot blood splashed across the deck. Another soldier rushed him, and Euron slammed him aside with a spiked mace he had claimed from a fallen foe. The soldier's skull caved in with a sickening crunch. Euron laughed, a sound that carried over the hiss of flames and the crash of steel. All around, the Tyrell forces buckled. One battered galley tried to ram an Ironborn warship from the side, succeeding in punching a hole in its hull, but the Reavers swarmed aboard, turning the ramming ship into a grave. 2 Tyrell banners fell into the sea, their embroidered roses stained red as they sank. Within half an hour, the water was slick with debris and bodies. The Ironborn ships reformed, continuing their unstoppable assault. A single Tyrell galley, the Proud Petal, fought valiantly. Its commander, a stout knight with a golden rose on his surcoat, refused to yield as Reavers boarded. He and his men killed half a dozen Ironborn, but eventually the press of bodies overwhelmed them. Euron himself watched from the Water Rose's stern, a trace of admiration gleaming in his eye. Then he raised a hand and his men finished the fight. The Proud Petal's defenders were cut down or tossed overboard. When it ended, only 2 Tyrell ships had managed to flee, raising full sails and vanishing toward the southwestern horizon. Euron allowed it. The pursuit might have cost more men than it was worth, and besides, he preferred that the survivors carry word back to Highgarden that Oldtown still lay in his grasp. Smoke drifted across the water as the Ironborn seized the battered remains of the Tyrell fleet. 1 or 2 ships that had not sunk were towed, stripped of their valuables. Prisoners, if any were captured alive, were quickly shown the meaning of Ironborn cruelty. Euron returned to the silence, coated in the sweat of battle, the salt air stinging his nostrils. The reek of death clung to him. His men roared in triumph, pounding fists on shields. On the deck lay the body of a highborn prisoner, or so it seemed from his elaborate armor. Euron crouched, flipped the man's visor open with a boot, and gazed upon the pale face of a youth who could have been no more than 20. Perhaps a lesser cousin of the Tyrells. "Your name?" Euron asked the corpse softly, though no reply would come. Blood trickled from the boy's mouth. Euron shrugged. "It matters little," he murmured. "You found the drowned god's embrace, or the stranger's, or whichever. Makes no difference." He rose and let the body be. The Ironborn, who had watched with a hush, resumed their celebration. They had dealt a blow to the Reach's attempt at relief. Oldtown was not free. Its defenders would know despair anew when they saw the black sails returning victorious. Euron felt no pity, only a strange and growing hunger. Destroying the citadel had been but one step. He might reduce all of Oldtown to cinders if it suited him. Or he might slip away at the peak of his infamy. The realm was wide and brimming with possibilities. Within Oldtown, the battered watchers on the high tower's upper ramparts saw the outcome from a distance. They watched the clash of sails on the horizon, recognized the swirl of black banners around the Tyrell greens, then saw, to their horror, how quickly the newcomers broke. By midday, they beheld the black sails returning unopposed. A gloom settled among them. They now knew that no immediate rescue would come by sea. If House Tyrell intended to retake Oldtown, they would have to do so by land, mustering a far larger force. That would take time. Time that Oldtown did not have, as disease and starvation threatened to ravage those who hid among the ruins. Lord Leighton Hightower, an aging figure rumored to be locked away in the uppermost reaches of the tower, sent down curt instructions. "Hold. Do not yield. The day of reckoning will come." Some swore they heard him muttering about ancient spells or conspiracies with black ravens. Others thought him mad with grief. Regardless, the Hightower's knights obeyed. They manned the walls, prepared ballista, ready tar to pour on any reavers who dared approach by boat. So far, Euron seemed content to let the tower stand, but they suspected his patience would not last forever. In the starry September, the refugees wept when word reached them that the Tyrell ships had failed. Septon Rassin and a handful of faithful men tried to comfort the masses, but fear was a gnawing presence. Could the Sept stand alone against the terror that had devoured so much of Oldtown's soul? Duran, the young acolyte, clung to hope that somewhere beyond the city a greater host would gather. He prayed they would not arrive too late. For all the gloom, small successes glimmered. Malachy and the novices, along with Ser Emin Beesbury's group, established a discreet line of communication with other survivors in Oldtown's labyrinth. They discovered that a cluster of watchmen and volunteers had made a redoubt near the city's northern gates, controlling a key approach. Others hid in the undercity vaults beneath the old temple district, planning sabotage. With careful messengers, often children small enough to wriggle through gaps in rubble, they passed notes scrawled on scraps of parchment. Some recommended a citywide uprising at night or timed attacks on Reaver patrols. The novices wanted no part in open warfare, but they recognized that without some coordinated effort, the Ironborn would tighten their hold day by day. At the Street of Loom's outpost, daily life was harsh but not hopeless. Men foraged for food in abandoned storehouses or gleaned grain from the cracks. Sometimes they found sacks of barley or half-empty casks of salt fish, enough to keep from starving, at least for a time. They hammered boards over windows to create vantage points for archers. They sharpened spears and pikes. A blacksmith, discovered among the refugees, managed to set up a small forge in the corner of a yard. Though lacking many tools and materials, he was able to repair broken blades. Each little act pushed back against despair. Malachy's presence became a symbol of perseverance. Even if the citadel was gone, one Archmaester had survived. He moved among the men, offering counsel, reading from the fragments he had saved. Though his knowledge of healing was overshadowed by the horrific injuries he encountered, wounds that required more advanced care, he did what he could to instruct them in cleaning and binding cuts. He distributed small vials of antiseptic solution he had crafted from boiled herbs found in a local garden. It was not enough to combat all infection, but it staved off some fevers. In the flickering gloom of that improvised shelter, men found a measure of solace in knowing that the Maester's tradition lived on in even the smallest way. Occasionally, novices ventured out to glean for any remnants of books or scrolls. They found precious little. Yet in the blackened shell of a small scriptorium once maintained by an acolyte's father, they stumbled upon a hidden compartment containing half a dozen old scrolls. Most were genealogical lists or shipping records, but one contained an incomplete history of Oldtown's earliest years under House Hightower. Another held notes on medicinal herbs. Malachy read them with shining eyes, though the partial contents only reminded him how much had been lost. Still, it was something. These scraps, gathered into his coffer, formed a tiny seed of hope, like the small lamp kept lit in a monstrous darkness. Days turned to a week, then two. Oldtown, battered and partially burned, did not lie still. More refugees slipped out at night or found ways to hide from the Ironborn. Pockets of disease erupted amid the squalor, claiming the weak. The Reavers themselves began to suffer from the city's meager spoils, turning rowdy or rebellious. Euron's iron will held them in check, but he sensed the shift in his men's mood. They had done what they came to do: plunder, burn, and sow terror. Lingering too long risked confrontation with the main Tyrell host. The men wanted either a final spree of violence or to weigh anchor and sail to more lucrative shores. Euron, though, was not yet done. By the third week, rumors circulated that he had ventured beneath Oldtown, exploring crypts known only to House Hightower or to certain orders of the faith. Some said he tortured local priests or lesser maesters to glean knowledge of hidden vaults. Others believed he had discovered passages beneath the starry September. The Reavers posted near that district reported hearing strange chanting at night. Whether it was Euron's twisted rituals or merely the faith's desperate prayers, none could be sure. Fear spread anew. People whispered that if the crows I found something truly dark in Oldtown's depths, no corner of the realm would be safe. It was then that the agents of resistance decided upon a plan. A group of watchmen, guided by Malachy's novices and some of the local faithful, would attempt a decisive strike. They had no illusions that they could kill Euron Greyjoy easily. He was surrounded by loyal Ironborn at nearly all times. But if they could disrupt his leadership or sabotage the silence itself, the blockade might break. Even the Reavers, for all their brutality, might lose their nerve if their feared captain was slain or forced to flee. Sir Emin Beesbury volunteered to lead an infiltration. They had discovered an old canal that ran beneath a row of warehouses, connecting to the harbor through a disused floodgate. If they could slip a small squad in by rowboat at night, they might sabotage the silence from below, or at least set it aflame. Without that dreaded flagship, Euron's aura of invincibility could be shattered. A dangerous plan, but desperation rarely fosters safety. Maliki wanted no part in direct bloodshed, but he recognized the necessity. He pledged to keep the novices back, focusing on preserving their small library of scraps. Still, one or two no. Vices insisted on joining, particularly Oswald, the same young man who had guided them out of the citadel. He was no stranger to risk, and he believed in fighting for the city that had once given him a future. With a quietly determined expression, he strapped on ill-fitting leather armor and took up a short sword. A date was set, the next new moon, when the darkness would be thickest. The conspirators gathered what little wildfire remained from a hidden store the maesters had once kept, though most had been destroyed or stolen by Euron. They had only a small cask. Even so, it might be enough to set a blaze if placed carefully in the Silence's hold. Meanwhile, some of the men loyal to House Hightower would launch a diversionary raid near the southwestern quarter, drawing the Ironborn's attention away. It was a desperate gamble. If the infiltration was discovered, every participant would likely die. But if it succeeded, Oldtown might have a chance. The night came with a stillness that felt ominous. Clouds veiled the moon, rendering the harbor black. From the vantage of the Street of Looms outpost, the infiltration party set forth just after midnight. Sir Emin, Oswald, and half a dozen other men slipped out of the yard, crossing broken streets in total silence. Their footprints mingled with pools of shadow. Another group of watchers followed behind at a distance, ready to offer support if everything collapsed. They made their way to an abandoned warehouse by the canal, pushing open a rotted door. Inside, the stench of stagnant water assaulted them. A few guttering lanterns revealed a half-silted channel that once allowed small barges to come and go. Now it was partially clogged with debris. One man tested the water depth, muttering curses under his breath. It was passable, barely. In the gloom, they found a derelict skiff tied to a cracked stone post. They carefully lowered their supplies into it, including the cask of wildfire, sealed with wax. Sir Emin, clad in partial plate and a tattered tabard, gingerly eased himself into the boat. It wobbled dangerously. One man nearly lost his footing, grabbing a wooden beam to steady himself. With hearts pounding, they began to row, pushing the skiff along the narrow channel. Above them, the warehouse roof stood mostly intact, so no Ironborn on the quays would see them just yet. The water lapped quietly against the hull. Oswald clutched the sword in sweaty palms, scanning for any sign of movement. The plan called for them to emerge in the harbor, hugging the shadows of anchored ships until they reached the Silence. Then they would slip aboard or place the wildfire below the waterline. The cask was rigged with a crude fuse, courtesy of a half-trained squire who claimed some knowledge of pyrotechnics. It was a slender thread that might burn for half a minute before detonating. Enough time to escape, hopefully, if the gods were kind. The skiff glided forward. The men used muffled oars, rags wrapped around the blades to reduce noise. They reached the far end of the warehouse, where a rusted gate blocked the exit to the harbor. Two men carefully unfastened the corroded latch. It squealed softly, making them all freeze. No shouts followed. They exhaled in relief. Then, with painstaking slowness, they eased the gate open just wide enough for the skiff to pass. The tide pulled them out into the harbor. Despite the darkness, the stench of the city gave way to a broader tang of salt. Far across the water, pinpricks of torchlight glowed from the Ironborn ships or from makeshift braziers on the quays. The men let the current drift them along, rowing only in small strokes to steer. Every piece of driftwood or floating wreckage was a friend, offering partial cover. They prayed that no watchful eye on deck would detect their silhouette. Some distance away, a faint roar signaled that House Hightower's men were launching their diversionary strike. Shouts drifted on the wind, followed by the clashing ring of steel. A few alarm horns sounded from the southwestern quarter. That was the signal. With luck, the reavers near the docks would rush to join the fight, leaving the Silence under minimal guard. The infiltration team pressed forward, hearts hammering. They spotted the distinctive shape of the Silence soon enough. Even in the darkness, her carved figurehead loomed as though lamenting lost souls in the night. A single lantern glimmered at the stern, revealing the outline of the deck rails. Euron was known to keep minimal light aboard, for he claimed to see well in darkness, or perhaps he simply believed darkness was his ally. Sir Emin motioned for the rowers to ease off. The skiff glided silently closer, each moment a test of courage. When they drew near, they saw a rope ladder hanging from a side beam, presumably used by crewmen. No Ironborn were visible at the rails. Perhaps they were ashore or focused on the distant commotion. Still, the men dreaded the possibility of a guard lurking out of sight. Ser Emon, jaw clenched, signaled that 2 men should remain in the boat while the others climbed aboard with the cask. They would position it in the hold, light the fuse, then slip back. If all went well, the silence would be consumed by flame. Oswald volunteered to climb first. He handed his sword to a comrade, then gripped the rope ladder. Step by step he ascended, mindful that any creak could betray them. The hull smelled of tar and brine. The young novice's heart thundered in his chest. A single breath. Another. He reached the top, extended an arm, and slowly hoisted himself onto the deck. The boards felt solid under his palms. Gritting his teeth, he crouched low, scanning. He saw dim shapes of rigging and a few barrels. A lone brazier at middeck cast a faint glow. No movement. Carefully, he signaled downward. Ser Emon followed, then another man with the cask of wildfire. 2 more men joined, leaving the last pair behind to guard the skiff. They fanned out, each brandishing a weapon or a small lamp covered with cloth to dull its glow. The hush seemed deafening, broken only by the slap of water against the hull. The smell of old blood and strange incense lingered, as though Euron's horrifying rites had seeped into the wood. Oswald shuddered. Near the stern, they spied a door leading below decks. That would be the hold, or close to it. Ser Emon took point, sword in hand, pushing the door open. It swung inwards with a faint squeal of hinges. Inside, darkness pressed in thickly. The men exchanged tense looks, then stepped down a short flight of stairs. They emerged into a corridor that reeked of rotting fish and stale air. A single lantern flickered further down, revealing beams overhead carved with twisting runes. One of the men hissed in disquiet, recognizing the shapes as foreign glyphs. At the far end, a heavier door presumably led to the cargo hold. They moved swiftly but carefully. Then, from a side cabin, a shape emerged. A reaver with a tangled beard and bleary eyes, likely awakened by the faint noise. He blinked, confusion turning to fury as he recognized intruders. He opened his mouth to shout, but Ser Emon flung himself forward, driving his sword into the man's chest. The reaver's cry became a gurgle, though not before a half-formed shout escaped his lips. The infiltration team froze, bracing for the alarm. Somewhere below, another voice cursed. Footsteps thudded on the planks. The men realized their stealth was undone. They had to move fast. Oswald and another man rushed to the hold door, slamming their shoulders against it. The latch held. More curses rang out from within. It seemed there were men inside. Perhaps the silence had a watch sleeping near the cargo. Ser Emon nodded to the man carrying the cask. "We'll fight them off. Place it wherever you can, then light it." Before they could respond, the door burst outward. 2 Ironborn reavers surged through, wielding axes. One crashed into Oswald, knocking him to the floor. He gasped, the wind driven from his lungs. The cask rolled aside. Another novice tried to seize it, only for an Ironborn axe to carve across his back. The novice collapsed with a scream. Chaos erupted in the cramped corridor. Ser Emon engaged one reaver, their blades flashing in the lantern light. Sparks flew as steel rang steel. Another intruder lunged at the second reaver, only to be driven back by a savage backhand blow. Oswald, dazed, scrambled to his feet. He saw the cask lying near the wall. If he could get it into the hold. But more footsteps echoed from the deck above. Reinforcements. It seemed the silence was not as lightly guarded as they had hoped. A reaver with a braided beard thundered down the stairs, brandishing a spear. He snarled, "Intruders! To arms!" His voice reverberated through the corridor. Oswald snatched up the cask, glancing at Ser Emon. The knight was locked in combat with 2 reavers now. He roared as he parried a blow. Another intruder tried to intercept the braided man, but was impaled by the spear. Blood sprayed. The corridor stank of iron and fear. Oswald realized there was no time to deploy the cask in the hold. This hallway would have to suffice. He wrenched the wax-sealed fuse open, fumbling for his flint. If the cask ignited here, it might blow a hole in the Silence's hull, and likely kill them all. He hesitated, heart pounding. Was it worth dying for? The memory of the citadel in flames, of Malachi's sorrow, of all the people Euron had slaughtered, flashed through his mind. He gritted his teeth. He struck flint against steel. Sparks danced, falling onto the fuse. It caught, fizzing with a small glow. Oswald shouted, "Light! Light!" He was warning his companions and also proclaiming that the plan was in motion. The Reavers heard and froze in sudden panic. Wildfire was a terror even to the Ironborn. Ser Emmon's eyes widened. "Retreat!" he bellowed, turning from the half-wounded Reaver he fought. The men still alive tried to scramble up the steps. The Reavers did too, half in pursuit, half in flight from the lethal green flame they knew might come. The corridor erupted in desperate violence, swords and axes tangling in a frenzied dance as everyone rushed for the exit. Oswald held the cask a moment longer, ensuring the fuse was truly lit. Then he hurled it down the corridor toward the hold. It rolled, leaving a sizzling line of sparks. A Reaver tried to kick it away, cursing. Another lunged for Oswald, who ducked under a wild swing and turned to flee. He tore up the steps, legs pumping. The deck above was in chaos now. Ironborn emerged from quarters, half-dressed, cursing the infiltration. One Reaver ran to the rail, presumably to call for more men from the docks, while others brandished crossbows. Ser Emmon and two other conspirators lunged into the open air, searching for the rope ladder or another means of escape. Crossbow bolts whistled, splintering the deck. One struck Ser Emmon's side, lodging in his armor. He staggered but continued, adrenaline fueling him. Then came the roar, a deep, thunderous blast from below decks. The silence shook like a living beast. A flash of bright green erupted from the corridor, flaring through every gap in the planks. An instant later, a shockwave tore the boards apart, hurling men off their feet. Oswald felt himself lifted by a surge of hot air, thrown across the deck. He crashed into the rail with numbing force. The entire stern seemed to disintegrate as the wildfire ignited the hold. Screams rose, cut short as men were consumed by green flame. The heat was indescribable. The silence rocked violently, water rushing in through a massive rend in the hull. Splinters of wood rained in all directions. Euron's men on adjacent ships or on the quays shouted in alarm, but it was too late. The proud flagship of the Crows, I was mortally wounded. Oswald coughed, tasting blood. The deck beneath him buckled. Seawater flooded up through the jagged tear. Flames devoured the stern, crackling green before turning orange as they caught tar. The Reavers howled in terror or rage. Some leapt overboard, vainly hoping to swim to safety. The novices, if any still survived, scrambled to find the rope ladder. Ser Emmon appeared from a swirl of smoke, calling Oswald's name. Blood trickled down his face. One of the other men from the infiltration team had died, flung headfirst into a shattered mast. Oswald tried to stand, but his left leg felt twisted. He clawed his way to the rail, guided by Ser Emmon's outstretched arm. Together, they peered over the side. The skiff was there, bobbing on the waves. The men left in it were staring in wide-eyed shock. The silence let out a final, agonized groan as another explosion, smaller but still potent, ripped through the midship. Possibly a second cask or an onboard store of volatile cargo. The entire hull began to list. Timbers shrieked. Ser Emmon helped Oswald over the rail, lowering him into the skiff. They nearly capsized as Reavers flung themselves down too, some screaming curses. The infiltration boat swayed, close to being overrun. One Ironborn tried to climb in, brandishing a knife, but Ser Emmon slashed his hand away with a sword. The Reaver fell back into the churning sea. "Row!" Ser Emmon bellowed once he was in the skiff. One of the watchers seized the oars, pulling frantically. The group strained, ignoring the cries of the dying. They slipped away from the doomed flagship. Oswald lay in a heap, vision blurring from pain. He glimpsed a final image of the Silence's mast snapping in half, falling forward in a shower of embers. Then the unstoppable waves claimed her. It was not a neat sinking. The raging wildfire, swirling with sea foam, lit the night in sickly green arcs. Half the ship sank quickly, dragging broken timbers down. Men floundered in the water, some clutching at the infiltration boat, but Ser Emmon's men beat them back with oars and spears. They had no capacity for more. As the wreck's final portion vanished beneath the waves, a hush fell over the harbor. Only the hiss of fire and the distant wails of the wounded broke the stillness. They had done it. The silence was destroyed. Whether Euron Greyjoy was aboard at the time, none could say. Some believed he often slept ashore in that commandeered guild hall near the docks or ventured elsewhere by night. But the blow to his prestige and to the Iron Fleet's unity would be enormous. In the skiff, the infiltrators risked a glance back. Green flames danced on the black surface of the water as if the drowned gods themselves had conjured a final, grotesque spectacle. "Row," Ser Emin repeated, his voice raw. And so they did, heading back toward the canal, hearts pounding, aware that half the city would soon be roused. They had no illusions that Euron's men would let this go unanswered. But for the first time since the sack began, the defenders had struck a mortal wound against the invaders. The cost in blood had been high, but so was the reward, the mighty silence, gone forever beneath the waves. News of the silence's downfall spread through Oldtown like a cleansing wind. Within hours, refugees in the starry September murmured that the Crow's Eye had been robbed of his flagship, that wildfire had devoured it. In hidden redoubts, watchmen and knights raised a muted cheer, though they braced for the Ironborn's wrathful retaliation. Even in the Street of Looms, Malachy listened with trembling relief as a wounded novice stumbled in at dawn, confirming Oswald had survived. The city's once broken spirit surged with a spark of hope. If the Ironborn could be hurt this badly, perhaps the foe could be driven out entirely. Euron's reaction was swift and brutal. Enraged by the loss, he ordered mass reprisals. Reaver patrols stormed through neighborhoods, setting fires, dragging suspected rebels from hiding, executing them in the streets. Screams echoed anew across the battered city. Yet no amount of savagery would bring back the silence. It lay in the harbor's depths, a ghost haunting Euron's ambitions. And that single fact changed the shape of the struggle. Some of Euron's men, disillusioned, began to question his leadership. Others cast nervous glances at the horizon, fearing the Tyrell banners might soon approach in earnest. The iron grip that had seized Oldtown now showed cracks. And so, amid the ruins of the citadel and the ashes of knowledge, the city's long night found a slender dawn. The fear of the Crow's Eye remained potent, and the specter of the citadel's destruction would haunt Westeros for generations. But there, in those darkened alleys, men had found the will to rise up. A single victory, a single spark. The pages of lost lore could never be restored, but life might yet endure. And if House Tyrell mustered its armies with the fury of a realm scorned, then perhaps Oldtown's darkest hour would not be its last. The wind off the harbor carried the mingled scents of blood, salt, and lingering smoke. Somewhere in that uneasy hush, a future was being written, a future in which the citadel might be rebuilt in some small measure, in which the realm would learn that knowledge could burn but never be fully extinguished. The day would come, soon or late, when Euron Greyjoy would either pay for his crimes or vanish into the depths he worshipped. Yet for now Oldtown bled but did not die. The blackest of nights had kindled a small flame of resistance that glowed, fragile but alive, against the monstrous gloom. So it was that, in the city once proud for its wisdom, men and women discovered that the will to survive could endure even when the greatest library in the known world lay in ashes. And as that flickering will grew, it promised that someday, somehow, the name Euron Greyjoy would not merely be spoken in terror, but spat in hatred, and that the realm he sought to break would rise from the carnage, forging a new era from the embers of the old.